The moment I drove onto my ranch that morning, I knew something was off. The familiar scent of fresh-cut grass and sun-warmed soil was overshadowed by a strange, pungent odor that made me stop dead in my tracks. My eyes scanned the horizon, grazing over the sprawling fields, the grazing cattle, and the fences I had meticulously maintained. Then I saw it. Bright orange flags dotted the landscape in a chaotic, unnatural line. My stomach sank. Sewer pipes. Not on a single patch of land, pipes cutting diagonally across my property, freshly dug, shoved into the ground as if someone believed they had the right to decide what happened on my land. And then it hit me, Karen. Of course. HOA Karen. Self-proclaimed ruler of suburban etiquette, the woman who called herself the moral compass of our little community. She had crossed the line. No, she had bulldozed it. My pulse quickened, but there was something she didn't know. Something Karen couldn't touch. Something that would make every threat, every complaint, every tiny attempt at control utterly meaningless. I am the director of the EPA. Not just a homeowner with a beef against the HOA, not just someone with a legal right to this property, but the authority over environmental enforcement, water safety, land management, and federal regulations. And she had just violated multiple statutes in one fell swoop. I took a slow, measured breath, keeping my composure, and stepped out of my truck. Each step across the dirt made a crunching sound that seemed louder than usual, echoing across the open ranch. Karen had no idea what was coming. She had made a mistake so colossal it would be remembered in HOA history. I pulled out my phone, snapping a few photos of the installation, evidence that would be as vital as it was satisfying. Then I noticed the pipes themselves, poorly installed, sloppy work, dirt spilling over trenches in careless, glaring ways. It wasn't just illegal, it was dangerous. A child could stumble. A cow could injure itself. And I smiled, because now I had the power to escalate this exactly the way I wanted. Karen, with all her fury and entitlement, was about to learn that crossing me meant dealing with the full weight of federal authority. My first call was going to be to her HOA president. And this call would set everything into motion, an escalation she would never see coming, and one that would teach her the meaning of overreach. I dialed the HOA president's number, keeping my voice calm but firm. "This is the director of the EPA," I said, letting the weight of my title hang in the air like a steel trap. The line went silent for a long moment, then a shaky voice responded. Karen had clearly briefed everyone, and the panic in the president's tone was audible. I explained exactly what I had found: sewer pipes illegally installed across private property, without permits, and dangerously sloppy. Every clause of the federal code relevant to environmental safety, land use, and sanitation I recited carefully, ensuring that each word landed like a hammer on the fragile foundation of HOA authority. The president stammered, promising to investigate and correct the situation immediately. I didn't hang up yet. There was a thrill in hearing their hesitation, knowing that this group of self-appointed regulators suddenly realized they were outmatched. I documented everything, taking videos of the pipes, the trenches, and the markers. I noted every potential hazard: standing water in the trenches, exposed pipe ends, and the way the installation could easily cause contamination of nearby fields. The evidence wasn't just for me, it was for federal compliance, for anyone who doubted that Karen and her HOA had crossed the line. As I walked the length of the ranch, I could see Karen approaching from the edge of the property, waving her arms wildly and yelling something about community rights and shared access. I let her rant. I let her believe she had some leverage. It made the moment all the more satisfying when I finally called her out. "Karen," I said calmly, "do you know who you're violating right now?" Her eyes widened, mouth opening, then closing, the words failing her. She didn't. That was the point. I let her flounder, realizing her threats meant nothing against federal authority. Her face twisted in anger, frustration, and disbelief as she realized her usual tactics: yelling, petitions, neighborhood meetings had zero effect here. I outlined the proper legal steps, what needed immediate correction, and what fines and violations could be levied. Karen's mouth moved, but no sound could overpower the truth. She had illegally invaded private property, compromised environmental safety, and underestimated the person standing before her. And now, every action she took would be recorded, scrutinized, and, if ignored, escalated directly through federal enforcement channels. I stepped back, letting her stew, knowing the HOA's control over me had evaporated. The pipes were illegal. The violation was clear. And I was ready to ensure the full consequences would be realized, calculated, precise, and completely unavoidable. Karen's expression twisted into something between panic and rage as she tried to regain control of the situation. She jabbed a finger toward the trench as if pointing at it would magically justify everything she'd done. "This is community property," she snapped. "You can't just shut down an improvement that benefits everyone." Her voice echoed across the open ranch, shrill and desperate. I didn't flinch. "Karen, you knowingly installed sewer pipes across federally registered agricultural land, without permits, without soil assessments, and without the landowner's permission." I paused, letting each word sink in. "Do you understand just how many laws that violates?" Her mouth tightened. The bravado was crumbling. I opened my folder, one I kept for inspections, and began reading off specific EPA regulations. Karen's glare flickered. She wasn't used to people pushing back, especially not with facts she couldn't outshout. She tried her usual tactic anyway. "The HOA voted. The community agreed." "The community," I interrupted, "does not overrule federal law." Her shoulders jerked back as if the words had physically struck her. Just then, a white HOA utility truck rolled onto my property. Two board members stepped out, scanning the damage with wide, stunned eyes. Their expressions said everything. They hadn't expected this. They approached carefully, whispering to each other, clearly trying to figure out how Karen had talked them into this disaster. "Is this all sewer?" one of them muttered. I gestured to the trenches. "Every foot of it. And every foot is illegally installed." The men exchanged horrified looks. One pulled Karen aside. Their argument hissed back and forth, a frantic whisper war carried away by the wind. I stepped back, giving them space. The more they talked, the more they understood the gravity of what had happened, what Karen had led them into. Minutes later, one of the board members walked over, shoulders slumped. "Sir, what do we need to do to fix this?" It was the first smart question they'd asked. I explained what compliance required: permits, environmental clearance, soil testing, proper engineering, written consent from landowners, basically everything Karen had skipped. Their faces paled with every word. "And the fines?" one asked quietly. "That's for after the investigation." Karen spun toward me, her voice cracking. "You wouldn't dare." I met her eyes. Calm. Unwavering. "Karen, you brought this on yourself." For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. Just silence, heavy, angry, helpless silence. The board members turned to her, realization settling in. Karen had just dragged the entire HOA into a federal mess. And I wasn't finished, not even close. Karen's fury had reached a boiling point, but now it teetered on the edge of panic. She stomped toward the exposed pipes, her heels crunching against the dirt, gesturing wildly, as if sheer volume could reverse reality. "This is outrageous," she shrieked. "You can't just..." Her words broke off when I held up my EPA badge, glinting in the morning sun. That little rectangle carried more authority than her entire HOA committee combined, and the weight of it seemed to physically hit her. I took a slow step toward the trench, deliberately pacing to emphasize my control. "Karen," I said evenly, "you've installed unpermitted sewer pipes across private property, violated federal regulations, and compromised environmental safety. This is not a neighborhood disagreement. This is a violation with consequences. Her eyes widened. She opened her mouth, searching for a retort, but no words came. She wasn't used to this kind of confrontation. Usually, she could intimidate neighbors, stir up petitions, and control meetings. But against federal authority? She had no leverage. Meanwhile, the HOA board members hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to intervene or stay back. Their earlier bravado had dissolved into silent shock. I motioned toward the improperly buried pipes. These need to be removed and replaced correctly, with proper permits, soil testing, and engineering oversight. Failure to comply could result in federal penalties. One of the board members muttered, We had no idea it was this serious." Karen spun to glare at them, mouth trembling. "You signed off on this. You voted." "You voted blindly," I interrupted, my tone firm. "And now you're responsible for remedying it." The tension stretched across the ranch, broken only by the wind rustling through the tall grass. Karen's voice cracked, almost desperate. "You can't. I mean." I let her falter. Sometimes silence is more powerful than words. I pulled out a clipboard with a formal inspection checklist detailing violations and corrective actions. I handed it toward the board. "Here's your roadmap. Follow it. You'll thank me later." Karen's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, likely planning calls to lawyers or sympathetic neighbors. But the reality was unavoidable. Every action she took from this point forward would be scrutinized. Every word, every signature, every attempt to bypass compliance would be documented. I stepped back and surveyed the ranch, the pipes, the trenches, the sprawling landscape, all under my authority now. Karen's screams had lost their power, fading into the background like a bad memory. Today, she learned that entitlement ends where federal law begins. And the board understood, crossing me wasn't just foolish. It was illegal. The sun climbed higher, casting crisp shadows across the field. Karen's reign of intimidation had been effectively neutralized, and the ranch, my property, my responsibility, my authority, was secure. With Karen's screaming fading behind me, I turned my attention fully to the pipes and the mess she had left behind. The trenches weren't just illegal, they were sloppy, dangerous, and a liability. Soil was unevenly displaced, water pooling in low spots, and some pipe ends were exposed. It was a recipe for contamination, accidents, and long-term environmental damage. This was exactly why I kept meticulous records and inspections as the director of the EPA. I started walking the length of the installation, snapping photos, and taking notes. Each corner of the property, each foot of improperly buried pipe, was documented. These wouldn't just serve as evidence, they would ensure that any legal or regulatory action could not be disputed. I could already see the implications: fines, mandatory remediation, and the possibility of forcing the HOA to pay for professional contractors to fix the disaster. Karen had underestimated the seriousness of what she'd done. The board members hovered behind me, silent, watching the process with a mixture of fear and admiration. They were beginning to understand that the rules they had ignored or blindly trusted Karen to uphold were not suggestions. They were enforceable regulations with real-world consequences. I could see their shoulders tense as the reality sank in. Then Karen returned, dragging her phone like a lifeline. She spoke rapidly into it, calling lawyers, neighbors, anyone she thought could rescue her. Her voice carried across the ranch, angry, pleading, panicked but powerless. I stopped her with a single, firm statement. "Karen, I suggest you put the phone down. Everything you're saying is already being documented, and anything outside of compliance is on record. You cannot talk your way out of this." Her hands shook, but she obeyed. The storm in her eyes was palpable, but I had the calm advantage. I began walking her through the steps necessary to correct the violations: removal of the improperly laid pipes, soil testing to prevent contamination, proper engineering oversight, and permit approvals. I explained the timeline, emphasizing that any attempt to circumvent the process would only make matters worse. The board members nodded, writing notes diligently, clearly realizing they were lucky the situation had not escalated further. Karen, however, remained frozen in place, anger and fear battling for dominance. I could almost see her internal calculation, realizing that for once, she wasn't in control. By the time I finished my walkthrough, it was clear, the ranch was safe, documented, and under my authority. Karen's ego had been checked, the HOA was terrified of the consequences, and I had reinforced the power of proper authority. For the first time, they understood, breaking the rules on my property wasn't just audacious, it was illegal. I stepped back, letting the sun reflect off the exposed pipe ends, and smiled quietly. Karen's reign of unilateral decision-making had come to an abrupt and irreversible halt. After the initial confrontation, I called in a professional environmental assessment team. The pipes Karen had installed were a nightmare waiting to happen. Soil samples, trench measurements, and water drainage tests were all urgently required. While the EPA has broad authority, even I prefer to rely on specialists for a precise, legally binding report. Accuracy would leave no loophole for Karen or her HOA to exploit. The assessment team arrived mid-morning. Their trucks kicked up clouds of dust as they set up equipment, measured trench depths, and documented every inch of pipe placement. Karen hovered at a distance, still fuming but too intimidated to intervene directly. She muttered about overreach and bureaucracy, but no one listened. I allowed her a few minutes of futile complaining before redirecting focus to the matter at hand. I walked the team through the site, pointing out improperly buried pipe ends, uneven trenches, and areas where soil compaction could lead to contamination or flooding. They nodded, taking photographs and making notes, clearly impressed by the extent of documentation I had already collected. This wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about preventing real environmental hazards. Karen's sloppy work had endangered more than just my property, it could have affected water tables, livestock, and downstream neighbors. Meanwhile, the HOA board members were scribbling furiously in notebooks, whispering questions to each other. Their earlier arrogance had dissolved into panic and shame. One board member approached me, voice trembling. "Sir, how did we let this happen?" I shook my head slowly, replying, "Because someone thought entitlement could replace responsibility." Karen's glare from the edge of the field said everything, she knew she had underestimated me. By mid-afternoon, the assessment team had completed preliminary tests and handed me a full list of violations. Every pipe, trench, and unauthorized installation was catalogued. The report would be submitted officially, leaving the HOA liable for remediation costs and potential federal fines. Karen's mouth opened to protest, but I raised a hand. No arguments, no petitions to neighbors, just compliance. Her defiance faltered, her usual arsenal of intimidation rendered useless. The ranch finally began to feel like my domain again. The air felt cleaner, calmer, with the hum of cattle and the breeze rustling the tall grass. I took a moment to survey the property, reflecting on how one person's arrogance could spiral so dangerously and how authority, properly applied, could restore order quickly. Karen realized she had not only failed but exposed the HOA to serious consequences. I had not even begun to leverage the full weight of my authority. The pipes were her undoing, and my patience, preparation, and power ensured they would be addressed legally, completely, and without compromise. The next morning, I drafted the formal notice to the HOA, detailing every violation, every improper installation, and the corrective measures required. Each word was deliberate, legally precise, and impossible to misinterpret. Karen had spent years trying to bend rules, intimidate neighbors, and manipulate outcomes, but this document made it abundantly clear that no amount of bluster could override federal law. I sent the notice electronically and by certified mail, ensuring a paper trail that could not be ignored. Almost immediately, the HOA board received a flurry of calls and emails from concerned members. The community was now aware that their self-proclaimed moral guardian had overstepped dramatically. Karen, of course, was the epicenter of the storm, pacing back and forth near the ranch entrance, muttering about unfair treatment and overreach. I didn't react. Her words held no weight against the authority of the law. I instead focused on the logistics of remediation. Contractors were scheduled, engineers and soil specialists confirmed, and permits were prepared. Everything was in motion to correct the disaster Karen had caused. The pipes would be removed properly, trenches filled and stabilized, and environmental compliance fully restored. The board members nodded silently, recognizing for the first time the true cost of blind obedience to Karen's whims. By mid-afternoon, Karen finally confronted me directly. She attempted her usual tactics, shouting, dramatic gestures, and frantic justifications. "You can't, this is ridiculous. It's our community," she yelled. I stayed calm, raising my EPA badge slightly. "Karen," I said evenly, "this is my property and a federal violation. You have no authority here. All actions going forward will be documented, regulated, and enforced according to the law." Her face turned red, lips trembling. For the first time, her anger was tempered by fear. She realized that her attempts to control the situation had failed spectacularly. The HOA board now looked at her skeptically, understanding that her ego had led them into serious legal jeopardy. I spent the remainder of the day coordinating with engineers and federal compliance officers, ensuring all work would be conducted meticulously. Every trench, every pipe, every piece of equipment was accounted for, photographed, and logged. By evening, the ranch looked calm once more, though the pipes still marred the landscape. Karen stood at the far edge of the property, arms crossed, defeated but unwilling to admit it aloud. The board members whispered among themselves, clearly weighing the consequences of inaction. The message was clear: arrogance and entitlement may provide temporary satisfaction, but when rules are broken on my property, the law and proper authority prevails. The pipes were only the beginning. Karen had no idea how far the repercussions would reach, and I intended to make every consequence count. The following days were a flurry of activity. Contractors arrived early, trucks rumbling across the ranch, and crews began carefully excavating the illegally laid sewer pipes. I supervised every step, documenting progress, ensuring that safety protocols were followed, and confirming that no additional violations occurred. Karen lingered at the perimeter, arms crossed, face red with a mixture of fury and humiliation, occasionally shouting instructions or complaints that went completely ignored. I walked alongside the crew, inspecting the trenches and guiding them to the areas that needed immediate attention. The pipes, haphazardly installed, were removed section by section, soil was replaced, and the land gradually returned to its original state. Every step of the process was meticulously recorded, photographs and notes filed for federal documentation. This wasn't just about correcting the problem, it was about ensuring that Karen and the HOA understood the seriousness of their actions and the consequences of bypassing legal requirements. By late morning, the HOA board members finally approached me directly, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and relief. "Sir," one whispered, we didn't realize how serious this would get." I nodded, understanding that many of them had blindly followed Karen's lead, unaware of the legal and environmental implications. "This isn't a matter of opinion," I explained calmly. "Ignoring regulations can lead to federal fines, remediation costs, and liability for damages. You're fortunate that corrective action started early." Karen, overhearing the conversation, spun toward me with a furious scream. "You're making this personal. It's our community, and you're trying to humiliate me." I raised my hand, letting the badge catch the sunlight. "Karen, this isn't personal. This is law. You chose to cross the line. Every action taken on this property must comply with federal regulations, and you have no authority here. Her frustration was palpable, but her arguments had lost all credibility. The board members exchanged nervous glances, clearly realizing that her influence had been overestimated. Every command she issued, every petition she filed, now held no weight against documented federal authority and environmental compliance. By the end of the day, the pipes had been fully removed, trenches leveled, and soil restored. The ranch slowly returned to its natural state. The crews packed up, leaving behind clean, compliant land. Karen's shoulders slumped, her energy spent in futile resistance, while the board members quietly absorbed the lesson: entitlement and overreach have real consequences when confronted with authority and law. Standing atop a small ridge overlooking my ranch, I surveyed the restored landscape. The sun glinted off the freshly leveled fields, and I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Karen's arrogance had been checked, the HOA humbled, and the law upheld. Today had been a clear message: crossing me comes with consequences. The following morning brought a calm that felt almost surreal. The ranch, once marred by illegal sewer pipes, now gleamed under the rising sun, soil leveled, trenches filled, and the landscape restored. Cattle grazed peacefully, unaware of the drama that had unfolded over the past week. For the first time in days, I could walk the property without tension, knowing that every violation had been addressed and documented. Karen, predictably, lingered at the edge of the ranch, arms crossed, cheeks flushed with humiliation and anger. Her attempts to intimidate or manipulate had failed completely. The HOA board, meanwhile, approached me cautiously, a mix of respect and fear in their expressions. They had witnessed firsthand what happens when rules are broken and authority is ignored. It was a lesson they would not soon forget. I gathered everyone together for a final briefing. I reviewed the work that had been completed, explained the official documentation, and outlined the ongoing compliance measures. The contractors and assessment team confirmed that all environmental and federal requirements had been met. Karen attempted to interject multiple times, but each protest was met with calm, factual responses, leaving her sputtering in frustration. By the end of the briefing, she had no words left, only silent, glaring defeat. I turned my attention to the board. "Let this serve as a reminder," I said firmly, "that no amount of entitlement or personal opinion can supersede the law. Compliance isn't optional. Responsibility isn't negotiable." They nodded solemnly, absorbing the gravity of the situation. Karen, isolated on the outskirts, finally seemed to comprehend the full scope of her error. The HOA's authority had limits, and those limits had been clearly defined by the law and enforced without hesitation. As the sun climbed higher, I took a slow walk across the restored fields, feeling the warmth of the morning on my back. The smell of fresh soil and grazing cattle filled the air, a reminder that proper stewardship and respect for rules yield not only compliance but peace. Karen's arrogance had disrupted the ranch, yes, but the resolution had reaffirmed order, authority, and accountability. Before leaving the property, I made one final call to the EPA office, confirming the remediation had been documented and that follow-up inspections would ensure continued compliance. Karen and her HOA had been humbled, the ranch protected, and a precedent set: illegal actions, no matter how bold, are always subject to consequence. Standing atop a ridge, surveying the entire ranch, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Today wasn't just a victory over one person's hubris, it was a reaffirmation that authority, preparation, and patience always prevail. Karen had crossed a line and the law had won.